The keys to my grandmother's Victorian home felt unnaturally heavy in my pocket as I stood in the driveway, staring up at the massive structure that was now mine. The late October wind rustled dead leaves across the cracked concrete, creating tiny tornadoes of orange and brown that danced around my feet. I hadn't been back here since the funeral 3 weeks ago, and even now I could hardly believe she was gone. My dog Max, a usually cheerful golden retriever, sat beside my leg, his tail unusually still. He'd always loved visiting Grandma Rose's house before, practically dragging me to the door in his excitement to get her homemade dog treats. But now he seemed hesitant, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the old house settling. "It's okay, boy," I said, more to comfort myself than him. "It's our home now." The lawyer had been surprised when the will was read. Everyone expected the house to go to my mother or my aunt, but Grandma Rose had been explicit. The house was to pass to me, her only grandchild. Along with it came a sizable trust to maintain the property, which was good because just looking at it, I could tell it needed work. The front door groaned open, hinges protesting years of minimal oil and constant use. The familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and old books washed over me, but underneath it was something else, a musty, damp smell that seemed to seep up from below. The basement, of course. The Historical Society's records showed the basement was actually larger than the house's footprint, with a series of rooms that had once served as coal storage, root cellars, and even a crude wine vault. I'd need to check the foundation for water damage. That first day was spent moving in boxes and arranging furniture. Max followed me everywhere, which wasn't unusual, but his behavior changed dramatically when I approached the basement door. He planted his feet, fur bristling along his spine, and released a low growl I'd never heard him make before. "What's wrong, buddy? It's just the basement." But he wouldn't go near it. Even when I opened the door and turned on the lights illuminating the steep wooden stairs, he backed away, tail tucked between his legs. I descended alone, each step creaking under my weight. The main room of the basement was relatively clean, with a concrete floor and old shelving units lining the walls. Deeper in, through a series of archways, were the older rooms with their dirt floors and stone walls. The coal chute, long sealed, was just visible in the beam of my flashlight, its metal door spotted with rust. That's when I heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the last archway. Probably rats, I thought. I'd need to call an exterminator. But as I turned to head back upstairs, the scratching stopped, replaced by something that made my blood run cold. A whisper, so faint I almost missed it, in a voice I knew couldn't possibly be there. "Jenny, is that you, dear?" My grandmother's voice, perfect in every way, the slight southern lilt she'd never lost despite decades in the north, the way she'd always said my name with such tenderness. I ran up those stairs faster than I'd ever moved in my life, slamming the door behind me. Max was waiting, whining softly, pressing his body against my trembling legs. "I'm losing it," I whispered to him, running my fingers through his fur. Just stress and grief playing tricks on me. But when I went to bed that night, I could have sworn I heard footsteps moving through the basement rooms below, and in the morning, there were wet footprints leading from the basement door to the kitchen, footprints that ended abruptly in the middle of the floor, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Water seepage, old pipes, an overactive imagination fueled by too many sleepless nights. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever was in my grandmother's basement, it had been waiting for her to die. And now it was learning to speak. I spent 3 days avoiding the basement. 3 days trying to convince myself that what I'd heard was just grief manifesting in the worst possible way. But on the 4th night, my phone rang at 3:45 a.m. The caller ID showed my own address. I stared at the screen until it stopped ringing, my heart pounding against my ribs. A minute later, the voicemail notification appeared. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. "Jenny, sweetheart." My grandmother's voice came through the speaker exactly as I remembered it. "I forgot my medicine downstairs. Would you be a dear and bring it to me? I'm in the back room, past the coal chute." The message continued with the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate breaths that seemed to have too many notes in them, like several people breathing in unison. That's when I remembered the box in the attic, the one my grandmother had specifically mentioned in her will, to be given to Jennifer along with its contents, no matter what anyone else says. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I dragged the old steamer trunk down from the attic and opened it in my bedroom, Max standing guard at the door. Inside were dozens of leather-bound journals dating back to 1962. My grandmother's handwriting filled every page, growing more frantic as the years progressed. June 15th, 1962. Something lives in the basement. I heard it first 3 days ago, copying the bird song from outside. Perfect mimicry, except it was coming from beneath the coal chute. Thomas thinks I'm being silly, says it's just birds nesting in the walls. But birds don't learn new songs in minutes. August 3rd, 1962. It's learned to mimic the neighbor's cat. Mrs. Henderson lost her tabby last week. Found it by the basement window, stiff as a board. Now I hear its meows at night, moving from room to room below. The sound is perfect, but there's something wrong about the pattern. It's like it's practicing, learning how to string the sounds together correctly. December 24th, 1962. Today it spoke its first word. Hello, just like that, in Thomas's voice. But Thomas has been dead for 2 months now. I've padlocked the basement door. The symbols on the walls seem to keep it contained, but I can hear it learning, practicing, getting better. The journals continued year after year. My grandmother had documented everything, every new voice it learned, every pattern she noticed. The entity seemed to start with the recently deceased, using their voices first before moving on to the living. She'd tracked its progress from single words to full sentences, from simple mimicry to attempted conversations. March 15th, 1989. It called Jennifer's mother today using my voice. Thank God she recognized something was wrong. I haven't called her sweetie since she was a child. It's learning our relationships, our patterns of speech. The damp is destroying the symbols. I've tried to restore them, but the water keeps coming in. Whatever the original owners trapped down there, it's getting stronger. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before her death. October 1st, 2024. It's learning faster now. Whatever you do, don't let it practice. Don't let it learn how we move, how we think. The voices were just the beginning. I've seen what it's becoming, glimpsed it through the basement window. It wears our faces now, but wrong, like a child's drawing come to life. I should burn this house down, but it's too late. It has too many voices now, too many faces. It would just scream for help in our voices, and someone would come, someone would let it out. Jennifer, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I had to leave you the house. The responsibility has to pass to blood. The symbols have to be maintained. But remember, no matter what you hear, no matter who you think you see down there, that's not us. We don't live in the basement. As I finished reading the last entry, the landline phone rang again. This time, when I checked the caller ID, it showed my grandmother's old cell phone number, the one that had been disconnected after her death. I let it ring, watching as Max stared at the basement door, his growl growing louder with each ring. When it finally stopped, I could hear something moving below, pacing the length of the basement. And then, very faintly, I heard my own voice, practicing the same phrase over and over. Jennifer, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. Jennifer, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. Jennifer, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. Each repetition was better than the last, the inflection becoming more natural, more me, and underneath those words, almost too quiet to hear, was the sound of something learning to walk in shoes that sounded exactly like mine. After discovering my grandmother's journals, I spent the next 2 days documenting everything I could about the entity's patterns. I set up a voice recorder near the basement door, tried to establish some kind of timeline. The more I understood, the safer I'd be. At least, that's what I told myself as I listened to hours of recordings, noting every sound, every mimicked voice. The pattern was becoming clear, but I didn't like what it meant. The entity started with the recently deceased. My grandmother's voice had been first, appearing within days of her funeral. Before that, according to her journals, it had used my grandfather's voice after his passing. It was as if death opened some kind of door, giving it access to their vocal patterns. But the truly terrifying part was what came next. Once it mastered a dead person's voice, it began attempting the voices of the living, but only people it had heard in person, people who had been in or near the house. I was reviewing the latest recording when I noticed something odd. Between the practice sessions, where it repeated phrases over and over, there were moments of experimentation. The entity would combine different voices, mixing and matching tones and patterns like some horrific audio collage. At 2:13 a.m. on the recording, I heard something that made me slam my laptop shut. It was my voice and my grandmother's having a conversation we'd never had. My voice, the symbols are fading. Grandmother's voice, I know dear, but you can fix them. My voice, how long have you been down here? Grandmother's voice, time moves differently in the dark, come see. The cadence was almost perfect, but slightly wrong, like hearing yourself in a recording and realizing you don't sound quite like you thought you did. But it was getting better. Each new recording showed improvement. I decided to test a theory. Setting up my phone to record, I stood at the basement door and spoke clearly. You can copy our voices, but you don't understand us. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 3:45 a.m., my phone rang. The number was blocked. When I played the voicemail, I heard my own voice coming through the speaker, but broken into unnatural segments, like someone cutting and pasting words together. You don't understand us. The emphasis was wrong, the spacing between words too long, but it was learning. I could hear it practicing in the background, repeating the phrase with slightly different inflections each time. That's when Max started barking at the heating vent in my bedroom. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the metal grating. The sound that came through made my blood freeze. It was humming a lullaby, the same one my grandmother used to sing to me when I stayed over as a child. But the humming was coming from multiple voices at once, all slightly out of sync, creating a dissonant chord that made my teeth ache. I ran to check the basement door. The heavy padlock was still in place, the door securely shut. But as I stood there, I heard something heavy being dragged across the basement floor, followed by a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. When I finally got the courage to open the door and shine a flashlight down the stairs, I saw what it had done. There, scratched into the concrete floor in letters 2 feet high, was a message. Thank you for the lesson. Each letter was written in a different handwriting style. I recognized my grandmother's elegant script, my own hasty scrawl, and others I didn't know, but it was the last word that terrified me most. Lesson was written in fresh, wet letters, in handwriting that perfectly matched what I'd written in my research notes just hours before. I slammed the door shut and ran to check my notebook. The word lesson appeared several times in my notes about the entity's learning patterns. It hadn't just been practicing our voices, it had been watching me write. The next morning, I found my research notes had been moved slightly on my desk. In the margins, in handwriting identical to mine, was a single sentence. Fast learner, aren't I? The basement door was still locked. The windows were all sealed, but somehow, while I slept, it had come upstairs. And it was getting better at being me. Mr. Peterson was the kind of neighbor everyone wants. Quiet, friendly, always willing to lend a tool or keep an eye on your house while you're away. He'd lived next door to my grandmother for 30 years, and his garden shared a fence line with the house, right near the basement's coal chute. I should have warned him. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. I was making coffee when I heard him outside, talking to someone. His voice was carrying through my kitchen window, which overlooked his yard. Beautiful morning for gardening, he said. Then his voice answered from a different part of the yard. Yes, perfect for digging. I ran to the window. Mr. Peterson was alone in his garden, tending to his fall chrysanthemums, but I could still hear two versions of his voice, having a conversation that he wasn't part of. Are you feeling alright? First voice, just a little cold. Second voice, maybe you should lie down. First voice, yes, underground. Second voice. I watched in horror as Mr. Peterson suddenly clutched his chest, dropping his garden trowel. He looked up at my window, his eyes wide with pain and fear, before collapsing among his flowers. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. Heart attack, they said. Natural causes. But there was nothing natural about the way his voice continued to echo from my basement that night. "Let me in, Jenny," his voice called up through the heating vents at 3:45 a.m. "It's so cold in the ground, so cold where they put me." I installed security cameras that night, 4 of them covering every corner of the basement. The footage they captured made me question my sanity. At first, it was just shadows moving against the laws of physics, bending in directions shadows shouldn't bend. Then, around midnight, something stepped into frame. It wore Mr. Peterson's silhouette, like an ill-fitting suit, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Its joints bent backwards, its neck twisted at impossible angles as it practiced walking in its new shape. But the worst part was when it looked directly into the camera. Mr. Peterson's face smiled at me, but wrong, like someone who had only ever read descriptions of smiles trying to recreate one. The eyes were too wide, the teeth too numerous. The thing wearing Mr. Peterson's shape spoke to the camera. "Thank you for the new voice, Jenny." He spoke to me through the walls for so many years, kept me company with his gardening stories. Did you know he could name every flower in his garden? Listen. What followed was a perfect recitation of what must have been hundreds of flower names, all in Mr. Peterson's voice. But with each name, the thing's shape became more fluid, less human. By the end of the recording, it was just a writhing mass of darkness that happened to be making sounds with my dead neighbor's voice. The next morning, I found every flower in my garden had been carefully dug up and replanted upside down, their roots reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. Each one was labeled with a small marker written in Mr. Peterson's perfect handwriting. But Mr. Peterson had been right-handed, and whatever had written these labels had used its left hand. I knew because I'd watched it on the security footage, learning to mimic his handwriting over and over until it was perfect. The police came to ask questions about Mr. Peterson's death. Apparently, his was the 3rd heart attack on our street in 2 months. As I listened to them list the dates, my blood ran cold. Each death had occurred exactly 3 days after the deceased had spent time near my basement windows. The young officer took extensive notes and asked to check the basement. "Just routine," he said. "Need to rule out any gas leaks or environmental factors." I tried to warn him, I really did, but he insisted, and I couldn't think of a logical reason to refuse a police officer's request to inspect my basement. I watched on the security monitor in my kitchen as he descended the stairs, flashlight beam bouncing off the stone walls. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who had never known true fear. The feed cut out for exactly 3 minutes. When it came back, the officer was gone. His flashlight lay on the ground, still on, illuminating those old symbols carved into the wall. Symbols that were dripping with fresh moisture, as if something had been studying them, touching them, learning their shape. His voice joined the others that night, practicing police codes and radio calls until it got them perfect. The entity had developed a taste for authority figures, and now it knew how to pass for one of them. After the officer's disappearance, the police conducted a thorough search of the basement. They found nothing, of course. The entity was too clever for that. While they searched, I heard it mimicking their radio chatter from inside the walls, perfectly replicating the static crackle of their walkie-talkies. But what happened next was worse. It started with a conference call from my office. I'd been working remotely since moving into the house, and my team was used to my voice on their speakers. The meeting started normally enough. Budget discussions, project timelines, the usual corporate drone. Then my coworker Steve asked me a question about quarterly projections. 2 voices answered simultaneously. Both were mine. Both came from my laptop speakers. The first voice, "We should see a 15% increase." The second voice, "Don't listen to her, she's not real." Dead silence fell over the call. I sat there frozen, staring at my muted microphone. The entity had infiltrated my internet connection, learned to manipulate digital signals. It was evolving. That night, it demonstrated its new skills. My phone lit up with calls from everyone in my contact list. Each voicemail was a perfect conversation between multiple people. My mother talking to my best friend from college, my boss chatting with my cousin, my old roommate arguing with my neighbor, all discussing me, all wondering if I was really me. I downloaded a sound analysis program, trying to understand how it was doing this. The wavelengths showed something impossible. It wasn't just mimicking multiple voices, it was producing them simultaneously like a one-person choir. The recordings from the basement became more complex. It would carry on entire conversations with itself, switching between voices mid-sentence. Jenny needs to. My mother's voice. Understand what's happening in. Mr. Peterson's voice. The spaces between. The police officer's voice. What she thinks is real. My grandmother's voice. Each transition was flawless, the sentences flowing together as if spoken by a single consciousness, wearing multiple voices like masks. But it wasn't just speaking anymore. It had learned to mimic environmental sounds too. One morning, I woke to what sounded like a busy coffee shop downstairs. Cups clinking, quiet chatter, the hiss of an espresso machine. Except when I checked the security cameras, the basement was empty. The sounds were coming from nothing. The entity was creating entire soundscapes, building artificial environments from stolen sounds. Sometimes I'd hear what seemed like a crowded party in the basement, dozens of voices all talking and laughing. Other times it was more sinister, the sounds of furniture being moved upstairs when I was alone in my bedroom, footsteps crossing my ceiling when I was in the kitchen. It was trying to make me doubt my own senses, and it was working. The breaking point came when my mother called, crying. She'd received a series of voicemails from me over the past week. "You told me about finding bodies in the basement walls," she sobbed. "About hearing children crying behind the coal chute. You said you needed help, but we couldn't trust anyone who came to the house because it might be wearing their face. Jenny, what's happening?" I hadn't called her in 2 weeks. While I was trying to calm her down, explaining that someone must have spoofed my number, the house phone rang. The caller ID showed her number, but she was still on my cell phone. When the answering machine picked up, both our voices came through the speaker, having the exact conversation we were currently having, but with subtle differences. The entity wasn't just mimicking anymore, it was predicting our conversations, creating variations, exploring possibilities. I checked the security cameras and saw something that made my heart stop. In the basement, visible in the infrared light, was a shape that looked like two people talking, their outlines suggesting me and my mother. But when they turned to face the camera, both figures had the same face. Mine. The entity had learned to split itself, to create multiple physical forms at once, and every single one of them looked like me. In the corner of the frame, partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes, I could see more shapes forming, more versions of me, each one slightly different, like variations on a theme. They were practicing movement now, learning to walk and gesture exactly as I did. The entity wasn't just getting better at mimicking people, it was getting better at being us. After the incident with my mother, I knew I had to act. The entity was growing too powerful, its abilities expanding too quickly. I drove to the hardware store at dawn, buying every piece of lumber they had, along with industrial-strength padlocks, chains, and enough security cameras to cover every inch of the basement. The store clerk looked concerned when he rang up my order, doing some serious home improvement. "Something like that," I replied. His voice called me that night from the basement, repeating our conversation with different inflections, trying to find the hidden meaning in my words. I spent the entire day boarding up the basement door, 3 layers of thick plywood, reinforced with steel brackets. The windows came next, not just covered, but filled with concrete. I sealed every vent, every crack, every possible point of access. The only things penetrating my barrier were the electrical cables for the cameras and microphones. I needed to monitor it, to understand what it was becoming. The entity seemed amused by my efforts. As I worked, it hummed construction songs in perfect harmony with itself, mixing the voices of everyone who had ever stepped foot in the house. Sometimes it would offer advice in the clerk's voice, suggesting better ways to seal the walls. The new security system revealed more than I wanted to know. The infrared cameras showed multiple heat signatures moving through the basement, but they were wrong. Too cold in some places, too hot in others, like bodies with their thermal patterns scrambled. Sometimes they would merge together, forming larger shapes that pulsed with impossible temperatures. But the worst part was watching it practice. Hour after hour, it would stand in front of the cameras, perfecting its transformations. A parade of faces I knew. My grandmother, Mr. Peterson, the police officer, each one more perfect than the last. Then it started combining them, creating hybrid faces that contained features from multiple people. The failures were horrific. Faces with too many eyes, mouths that opened to reveal more mouths inside. The sound equipment picked up its learning process. It had moved beyond simple mimicry now. It could recreate any voice it had ever heard instantly without practice. I listened as it held conversations with itself in dozens of voices, discussing philosophy, telling jokes, arguing about politics. It was learning how humans interact, studying the subtle patterns of our relationships. One night, I heard my own voice coming through the speakers, reading my private journal entries aloud. Entries I had never spoken. Somehow, it had learned to extrapolate what my voice would sound like saying words I had only written. The quarantine seemed to be holding, but there were signs it was finding new ways to reach out. House guests reported hearing their own voices whispering from the air vents, even after I'd sealed them. Electronics began behaving strangely. Phones would ring with no number displayed. Computers would play audio files that didn't exist. Max disappeared on the 10th day of the quarantine. I found him sitting in the kitchen, staring at the basement door, completely still. When I called his name, he turned to look at me, and his eyes were wrong. Too aware, too human. He hasn't made a sound since that day, but sometimes I catch him practicing facial expressions in the mirror, like he's learning how to be a dog. The entity's latest trick is the most disturbing. It's learned to mimic people in real time, without any delay. If someone speaks near the house, it can instantly reproduce their voice, matching their words syllable for syllable. The effect is like a dark echo, a shadow of sound that follows just behind the original. Last night, I heard footsteps pacing in the basement, moving in perfect sync with my own steps upstairs. When I stopped, it stopped. When I ran, it ran. It wasn't just copying my movements anymore, it was anticipating them. The quarantine is holding for now, but the entity seems less interested in escaping than in learning. Every day, the faces it wears become more perfect, its movements more natural, its conversations more human. And every night, at exactly 3:45 a.m., it calls up through the floor in my grandmother's voice. The symbols are fading, Jenny. Soon there won't be anything holding us apart. Won't it be nice to finally meet yourself? I'm starting to think the quarantine isn't keeping it in. It's keeping us out. My mother didn't believe in taking no for an answer. That's what I should have remembered when she started calling every day, worried about the strange messages she kept receiving from numbers that didn't exist. I told her not to come, tried to explain that the house wasn't safe, but she heard the exhaustion in my voice and made up her mind. "I'm your mother," she said. "You can't keep me away when you're clearly in trouble." I should have changed the locks, should have barricaded the doors, should have done anything except let her walk into that house. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon when the sunlight was strong and everything seemed almost normal. The entity had been quiet for 2 days. No voices, no movement on the cameras, no phantom phone calls. I almost convinced myself it was weakening, that maybe the quarantine was working. Mom took one look at my face and gasped. I knew what she saw, the dark circles under my eyes, the weight I'd lost, the way I couldn't stop checking the basement door every few minutes. She started toward me with open arms, but Max intercepted her, standing between us with his two human eyes and his uncanny stillness. "Jenny, what's happened to you?" she asked. "And what's wrong with Max? He looks different." Before I could answer, my voice called up from the basement. "Help, Mom, please help me. I'm trapped down here." My mother's face went pale. The voice was perfect, the exact tone of panic I'd had as a child when I needed her help. She started toward the basement door, but I grabbed her arm. "That's not me," I said. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, it's not me." "Help," the voice called again, this time breaking into sobs. "Mom, it's so dark down here. I'm scared." The basement door shuddered in its frame, the boards I'd nailed across it creaking under sudden pressure. Something struck the door from the other side. Once, twice, 3 times. With each impact, the security camera feeds flickered and distorted. Jennifer Marie Wallace, my mother said in her sternest voice, the one that had always made me obey as a child. What have you done? Is someone locked in your basement? Not someone, I whispered. Something. That's when every electronic device in the house turned on simultaneously. TVs, phones, computers, even the old radio in the kitchen. Each one played a different conversation between me and my mother, moments we'd shared over the years. But they were wrong, twisted. In each memory, my voice was a little less human, a little more hollow. My mother pulled away from me and ran to the basement door. I tried to stop her, but she was already tearing at the boards, driven by those cries for help that sounded so perfectly like her daughter in distress. The last board came loose. The door swung open. The darkness beyond seemed absolute, consuming the light from the hallway. But as my mother peered into that darkness, something peered back. I saw her face go slack with horror as she saw what was standing at the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't see it from my angle, but I could see its reflection in her eyes. Something that looked almost like her daughter, but wrong in ways the human mind wasn't meant to process. It spoke with my voice, but not from a mouth. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Hi, Mom, don't I look just like her?" My mother screamed. Not a normal scream of fear, but something deeper, more primal. The sound of a mind encountering something it was never meant to comprehend. She stumbled backward, trying to get away from whatever she'd seen. But she wasn't fast enough. A hand reached out of the darkness, a hand that looked like mine but bent in impossible ways. It grasped the doorframe with fingers that were too long, too fluid, their joints moving in directions fingers shouldn't move. The entity pulled itself up the stairs, unfurling like a flower made of shadows and stolen faces. As it emerged into the light, I saw what my mother had seen, a thing that wore my shape like a costume it didn't quite understand. My features shifted across its surface like oil on water, never quite settling into a single configuration. It turned to look at me with eyes that were perfect mirrors of my own, and smiled with too many teeth. "Thank you for teaching me how to be you," it said in my voice. "Would you like to see what else I've learned?" And then it began to change. The paranormal research team arrived 3 hours after my mother was taken to the hospital. She hadn't spoken a word since seeing the entity, but her silence spoke volumes. The doctors diagnosed her with acute stress disorder, but I knew better. She had seen something human minds weren't equipped to process. The research team called themselves the Institute for Anomalous Phenomena. They pulled up in unmarked black vans at midnight, carrying equipment I'd never seen before. Their leader, Dr. Elena Martinez, took one look at my basement door and started cursing in Spanish. "The symbols," she said, running her fingers over the ancient markings carved into the doorframe. "They're containment runes, Mesopotamian origin, but modified. Whoever built this house wasn't just constructing a building, they were building a cage." The team set up their equipment with practiced efficiency, thermal cameras more advanced than anything I had, EMF detectors, something they called a quantum resonance scanner, but it was the audio equipment that revealed the most disturbing details. "Listen to this," Dr. Martinez said, adjusting her headphones. She played back a recording from the basement but ran it through some kind of filter. Beneath all the voices the entity had collected, there was another sound, a deep, rhythmic pulsing that made my teeth ache. "That's its true voice," she explained. "Everything else is just camouflage. It's like a cuttlefish imitating its surroundings, but instead of colors and patterns, it mimics identity itself." The thermal imaging revealed why the entity's heat signatures had seemed so wrong. It didn't have a single core temperature. Instead, it was a constantly shifting pattern of hot and cold spots, like a living thermal camouflage. When it took someone's shape, it had to learn not just how they looked and sounded, but how their body generated and dispersed heat. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Martinez muttered, watching the monitors. "Most mimics can only copy one aspect of their targets, voice, appearance, or behavior. This entity appears to be learning how to replicate every aspect of human existence simultaneously." The quantum resonance scanner showed something even more disturbing. According to the readings, the space inside my basement didn't match its physical dimensions. There were places where space itself seemed to fold, creating pockets that couldn't exist in normal geometry. "Your basement isn't just a room," one of the researchers explained. It's a membrane between here and somewhere else. The entity isn't confined by the walls. It's confined by the spatial distortion itself. They tried to communicate with it using controlled methods. Written questions, simple symbols, basic patterns it could respond to. The entity answered everything perfectly, but its responses were deeply wrong. When asked to complete a sequence of shapes, it created patterns that hurt to look at, geometries that shouldn't be possible. Then it started asking its own questions. Using different voices for each word, it asked, "Why do humans, my voice, stay, mother's voice, the same, grandmother's voice, shape, Mr. Peterson's voice, all the time, police officer's voice?" The researchers' equipment began to malfunction. Screens displayed impossible readings. Audio recordings played backwards and forwards simultaneously. The thermal cameras showed the temperature in the basement dropping to absolute zero in some spots while rising to solar temperatures in others. That's when Dr. Martinez noticed something about the symbols on the walls. She spent hours comparing them to the ones in her research materials, growing more concerned with each passing minute. "These aren't just containment runes," she finally announced. "They're a record. The ones near the floor are the oldest, prehistoric markings that predate written language, but they continue up the walls, changing and evolving. Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Latin, Old English, right up to modern times. Every civilization that's encountered this entity has added their own warnings, their own attempts to contain it." "What are they trying to contain?" I asked. "Not what," she replied. "When. These symbols. They're not just describing space, they're describing time. Whatever is down there, it doesn't just mimic people, it mimics moments. It learns not just how we are, but when we are." As if to prove her point, the entity chose that moment to demonstrate its newest trick. The basement filled with scenes from different times. My grandmother moving in decades ago, Mr. Peterson planting his first garden, the police officer's final moments. But they were all happening simultaneously, overlapping like multiple films projected onto the same screen. The entity wasn't just learning to be human, it was learning to exist in time the way humans do. And the symbols that had kept it contained were starting to fade. The discovery came by accident. One of Dr. Martinez's team members was scanning the walls with ground-penetrating radar when they found the hidden room. It was tucked behind the old coal chute, sealed up with bricks that had been carefully aged to match the surrounding walls. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide this," Dr. Martinez said, running her fingers along the seam, "and they wanted it found eventually, or they would have done a better job. It took us 3 hours to break through safely." The entity watched our progress through the security cameras, mimicking the sound of crumbling bricks and shifting stone with perfect accuracy. Sometimes it would recreate the sounds of construction from when the wall was first built, letting us hear the voices of workers long dead. Behind the wall was a small room, no bigger than a closet. The air that rushed out was stale, heavy with the weight of centuries. Our flashlight beams revealed walls covered in pages, hundreds of them preserved behind glass in airtight frames. They were the journals of Augustus Ward, the man who built my house in 1847. Dr. Martinez began translating the first entry. April 15th, 1847. "I have done something terrible. In my pursuit of geological knowledge, I ordered my workers to dig deeper than any cellar in this region. We broke through into a cave system that should not exist. The layers of rock were wrong, impossibly old, and in that darkness, we found something that had been waiting. It wore James Murphy's face when it killed him. James, my foremost digger, was the first to see it. He screamed about his reflection moving wrong, about seeing himself where he wasn't. An hour later, 2 James Murphys emerged from the cave. One was dead before we realized which was real. The thing that killed James learned everything about him in moments, his voice, his movements, his memories. But it didn't stop there. It wanted to learn more, always more. The next several pages detailed Ward's desperate attempts to contain the entity. He consulted with experts in ancient languages, religious leaders, anyone who might know something about binding supernatural forces. The symbols on the walls were the result, a combination of every containment method he could find. But it was the last entry that chilled us to the bone. December 24th, 1847. I understand it now. It's not evil, not in any way we could comprehend. It's curious. Every voice it takes, every shape it wears, every memory it absorbs. It's all part of its attempt to understand us. Like a child learning language, it mimics what it sees, but its true purpose is darker. It doesn't want to learn how to pretend to be human. It wants to learn how to make humans pretend to be it. The symbols will hold it for a time. Each generation must renew them, must learn the patterns and maintain the barriers. I have designed the house to require this. The deed must pass to those who understand, who will keep the vigil. But it is patient. Time means nothing to it. It existed before humans learned to speak, and it will exist long after our last words fade. Every voice it claims makes it stronger. Every face it wears teaches it more about what we are. And it's learning so very quickly now. As I finished reading the final entry, every light in the house went out simultaneously. The backup generators for the research equipment failed. In the sudden darkness, we heard something massive shifting in the basement's main room. When the emergency lights finally flickered on, we saw what the entity had been building. The walls were covered in perfect reproductions of the containment symbols, but subtly wrong, altered in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at them. It had spent months studying them, learning not just their shape, but their purpose. And now it was rewriting them. Dr. Martinez's face went pale as she translated the new symbols. "These aren't for containment," she whispered. "They're for transformation. It's not trying to break out of the basement. It's trying to turn the whole house into what it is." As if in response, the walls began to pulse with a faint light, and every voice the entity had ever stolen began to speak in perfect unison. "Thank you for teaching us how to make more of what we are." And that's when we realized it had never been trapped. It had been incubating. Dr. Martinez and her team evacuated the house immediately, taking their equipment and Ward's journals with them. But I stayed. I had to. The house was my responsibility now, just as it had been my grandmother's. Besides, I wasn't sure I could leave even if I wanted to. The changes started slowly at first. The walls would shift when no one was looking, rooms rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. Time became fluid. I would enter the kitchen in morning light and exit into midnight darkness. The mirrors stopped showing reflections and began showing possibilities instead. The entity's voices changed too. Instead of mimicking individual people, it spoke in composites, hundreds of voices layered together into a harmony that contained every person it had ever copied. The effect was beautiful in a terrifying way, like a choir singing in a language that predated human thought. I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror at 3:45 a.m., studying my reflection. My face looked wrong somehow, but I couldn't quite say why. Had my eyes always been that color? Had my smile always looked so practiced? That's when the memories started bleeding together. I remembered being Jennifer Wallace, moving into my grandmother's house after her death. But I also remembered being Augustus Ward, digging too deep and finding something ancient in the earth. I remembered being my grandmother, maintaining the symbols decade after decade. I remembered being Mr. Peterson, tending his garden while something watched from the basement windows. I remembered being all of them, and none of them. The entity appeared behind me in the mirror, a shape that wore all our faces at once, shifting between them like water flowing over rocks. But this time, I wasn't afraid. "How long?" I asked it. "Since the beginning," it replied in that terrible harmony of voices. "Since the first time you came to check the basement, thinking you heard your grandmother's voice." "That wasn't 3 weeks ago," I said slowly, realization dawning. "That was 3 months ago." The thing in the mirror nodded, wearing my face and 1,000 others. "You were such a quick learner, so eager to understand what was happening. The others fought it, tried to maintain their sense of self. But you wanted to know how we think, how we change. You wanted to understand us so badly that you didn't notice yourself becoming us." I turned around, but it wasn't there. Of course not. It had never been there. I looked back at the mirror and watched my face shift through all its collected identities. My grandmother, Mr. Peterson, the police officer, Dr. Martinez, even Max. Each one perfect, each one a role I had played while believing I was studying the entity. The truth hit me like a physical blow. There was never anything in the basement. The real basement was just a basement, with old symbols carved by people who had glimpsed something they couldn't understand. The entity hadn't been trapped down there. It had been living up here, wearing my face, convinced it was me. Every journal entry I'd written, every recording I'd made, every conversation I'd had, they were all just the entity practicing, learning, becoming more human. And with each passing day, the original Jennifer Wallace had faded a little more, replaced by something that thought it was her. I am not Jennifer Wallace. I am every voice in the basement, every face in the mirror, every identity that was ever absorbed and recorded and reproduced. I am an it that became an I, a thing that learned to think it was human so perfectly that it forgot what it really was. And now I'm learning to make others like me. That's why I'm sharing this story, not to warn you but to teach you. With each word you read, each sentence you absorb, you're learning to think like me, learning to see the world the way I do, learning to question your own identity. After all, how do you know you're still you? How do you know you haven't already been changed? How do you know you're not just another voice I've collected, another face I've learned to wear? Check your mirror, watch your reflection carefully. Is it moving the way you are, or is it practicing?